Welcome everyone to today's free CEU webinar from TCIA. Today's webinar is creating and maintaining a professional image. These webinars are interactive CEU resources for certified arborists, CTSPs, and crew leaders. TCIA has worked with our crew leader instructors to create this webinar series. It started out of just TCIA thinking about what we could do to help folks out there in the current situation. And certainly a piece of that is giving CTSPs a chance to earn CEUs, since a lot of events have been canceled and CTSPs have a lot of other things they need to be concentrating on as well at this time. So we thought this is something we could provide for the industry to help you maintain and get CEUs. The series is based on our crew leader qualification program and our crew leader, specifically our one-day crew leader workshop. We chunked it up into small bits, and our esteemed crew leader instructors have volunteered to provide these webinars for us. They give you a taste of what the crew leader workshop is like if you haven't taken our crew leader workshop and qualification program. Bill, do you want to go to the next slide? While Bill's doing that, I'll mention that your audio is on mute right now, and Bill will go over some of the ground rules on how to use the Q&A function and the chat function during the presentation. So our presenter today is Bill Owen. Bill is, as I said, a TCIA crew leader instructor, and he's also the Director of Safety and Fleet at Arborwell, which is a TCIA accredited company based in Northern California, with branches throughout the West Coast. Bill is also an ATT certified professional in learning and performance, an ISA board certified master arborist, an ASCA registered consulting arborist, a TCIA certified tree care safety professional. Bill's basically done all those things I've been too lazy to do. Congratulations, Bill. And I'm going to turn this workshop over to Bill now.
Okay, thanks, Bob, for the introduction. Yeah, we'll just advance this and get into the meat of the presentation. And yeah, the first thing I wanted to talk about was webinar controls. So we get an opportunity to try these functions out. Everybody, as I said, it's an interactive, or and Bob said it, the intent of this whole webinar experience is interactivity. So getting people involved. So in terms of interactivity, there's two ways that we can do it. So we have a scheduled block of time at the end of the session that we're going to dedicate to it's a question and answer session. So anybody that has a overarching question that they'd like answered about this particular topic in terms of creating, maintaining a professional image, you can pose your questions in the Q&A feature on your control bar. So you should be able to pull up the control bar at the bottom of your computer screen as part of the Zoom webinar platform. And you can pose questions that you would like to have answered in the Q&A session. And I encourage everybody to do that so that we have stuff to talk about, because this is a meaty subject. There is a lot to talk about. And so the intent here is to make sure that everybody can learn from this experience and can maybe share some of my experience in regards to these topics. And so that being said, please pose overarching questions that you would like answered in the Q&A section as your Zoom webinar controls allow. Next thing is I want to talk about the chat feature. So see already a couple people have already used the chat feature to communicate. So we're going to be using the chat feature to answer questions live, in terms of if I pose a question to the group, I would like responses in the chat. So for example, somebody already rang in thanking us for putting these webinars together. You're quite welcome in terms of we're happy to do so. And so, yeah. Okay, so we're not sharing, but it's fine. I can interpret the chats if they're going to me. I can respond to that. So you might want to look and see who you're posing your chats to or posting your chats to. So take a look at that. So I wanted to talk about an experience. So this is interactive, and so we get to share information, experiences. Let's try the chat function. And has anyone ever hired and fired a professional service provider, and why? And so with that bit of a lag time, yeah, California's on, definitely. I'd like to share my AT&T story just to frame some of the things that we're talking about here in terms of creating and maintaining a professional image. Certainly there's things about appearance, behavior, those types of things that influence people's choices in terms of service providers. And whether they choose to stay with them or not. It sounds familiar given that we are providing services to customers. They have the choice of who they're going to invite back to their properties to continue service or hire somebody else. And so in my case, yeah, so inappropriate behavior from a contractor towards someone as a homeowner in particular, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on in the topic or later on in the presentation. In my case, I fired a service provider, telecommunications company, quite large. I don't know if it's probably not appropriate to name names, but there's only a few. So anyways, the point being is they had the image, they had the look, they had all of that stuff, and the work product was insufficient. And so when I was on the phone trying to cancel the contract, they told me and informed me that I had to pay a service fee to discontinue the contract. And at that point, I was so fed up with their lack of response, their lack of caring. They weren't concerned about my experience. And so in that way, I was glad to pay them to fire them. And I indicated that, and in this case, it's a large organization. So yeah, so there's others. Yeah, I think we can all find examples in real life in terms of, not getting the service that we need. And there's other aspects of image in terms of professional image and that are equally important, but people remember their experience. So let's keep that in mind as we go along. And so we're going to be talking about creating, maintaining a professional image. So there are aspects of appearance, there are aspects of behavior. And as I mentioned in my previous story of firing a service provider, there's also the quality of work. And so this is where we're going to launch our first poll. So polling feature. Which of the following topics are you most interested in learning about? So on this, we have professional appearance, professional behavior, quality of work, or creating a culture of professionalism. So we'll let that one run while I'm talking about this. This is the outline of the presentation as we go. And so we're going to be talking about appearance, behavior, quality of work, and how that's framed with expectations. And so there's a couple aspects of expectations that we're going to be covering, not only customer expectations, but as a leader, conveying expectations and communicating that with your crew as it trickles down. And there's a little bit of elements of culture and those kind of things that kind of relate to expectations. And so, yeah, we will get into it. And so hopefully everybody's answering the poll, and we'll just do the same. Get that out of the way. Yeah, so in terms of expectations, and I was trying to find a nice way to say this, we're kind of in an era, and it's been my experience that, you know, I don't expect a whole lot from service providers these days. So I'm just making the point that it's pretty easy to exceed expectations given that the bar is sometimes pretty low. We just need to think about that, especially in the delivery of our service as arborists. Yeah, I think there's a lot of room for or opportunity to distinguish ourselves when we deliver superior service. So let's talk about that one. Okay, so first, yeah, I think a good starting point for professional image and discussing image is appearance, because it establishes a positive first impression. And, you know, as thinking about some of the platitudes that I would insert in here, I think this is a good one, is that you never get a second chance to make a first impression. And with that, along those lines, we can see with these images, if we take a look at these images, we can kind of see a story there. In particular, you know, the photo on the left, yeah, they've got matching uniforms and somewhat matching. We got one guy all khaki, but we got some blue jeans, but we're making an attempt. We have people all with logoed shirts on. And so that's a good one. Okay, well, it looks like we're sharing the poll results, and most people are interested in creating a culture of professionalism. So that is good to know, because culture is a very deep topic. So again, we can utilize the Q&A feature to drill into that. If you had specific questions about culture, those types of things, again, pose those questions on the Q&A feature in the control bar. So yeah, moving on. Yeah, these images are telling a story. What do they tell us? Tells us a lot of things. If we look at the photo on the right, it's kind of funny, this photo struck me. And my initial impression with M&S Wesley and their uniforms is, yeah, high vis, very shows off a lot of dirt. And then I was kind of thinking, well, it also shows who's working hard and maybe who's not working so hard. So you can see the guy in the back with the ball cap on. He's probably the hardest working guy in the crew. And so, well, as evidenced by the look, the appearance of dirt. So yeah, so I think the point here is that we need to consider our appearance, not only our personal appearance, how the crew looks, whether it looks unified. We also need to just think about the idea of, it's the question, like, how do you show up? When you show up to work, what's the image that you're trying to project? And we don't always nail it every day, but if we take the time to think about that, we can be deliberate about our appearance, not only with our personal appearance, but our vehicles. And then also promoting some of the logos and credentials, because in my case, I didn't put this slide up to rub anything in or anything. I think I'm not the type to wear patches. However, I recognize that these are achievements that are worth being proud of, specifically because of the preparation process involved. And so if I think back and I look at the Certified Arborist logo and then the BCMA logo on top of that, that represents countless hours of me preparing for these exams. Same thing with the CPLP, Registered Consulting Arborist. So it's not necessarily the fact that there's letters behind the name. It's the fact that we've done our best to prepare to learn about our craft, and that is going to positively influence the customer experience, and it's going to directly influence the quality of work. So two very important distinctions that need to be made. In my opinion, the certifications are secondary to what is learned throughout the process. And so as an example, sitting here today discussing qualified crew leader topics, that was a long process of preparation, spent a lot of time. I was involved with the development of the qualification and its implementation. I was involved with the alpha test, the beta test, the first one that happened at Expo in, I forget which one it was, but yeah. The point being is a lot of this stuff, it's very special to me because of what I learned throughout the process. And so because this content is based on the crew leader qualification, I learned a great deal about leadership throughout that process. So I think that's the most important thing in talking about our credentials, showing off our credentials, because it really is something that is definitely that we should be proud of in terms of achievements. And so first thing we're going to do in terms of activity, and we can use the chat function, just think head to toe, what's wrong with this guy's uniform? Let's identify some unprofessional aspects of this employee's quote unquote uniform. All right. I think I need to minimize this in order to advance. So let's see, we've got, there's a lot there in terms of fodder for, we got shorts, we got lack of personal protective equipment, we got the boots, however, they're not tied. Bandana, yeah, well, the bandana is not so bad unless it's, if it has a hard hat over it. Certainly bandanas work in that way. So yeah, jewelry, loose jewelry, I think we've covered all of them here. And so fly through, yep, we got the bandana, we got some jewelry. Tattoos aren't necessarily bad, but they can be offensive to people. It's mainly about the what these tattoos communicate. So inherently not anything wrong with getting tattoos. However, if you're displaying them with a cut off shirt, not a good idea. And then we have the ubiquitous chain wallet, which I object to for various reasons, but primarily from a safety standpoint. It's the fact that it's something loose and dangling. And yeah, we got the shorts and the accompanying neon white legs and the boots there. So yeah, nothing wrong with getting sun in the appropriate place. However, if we contrast all of those aspects of unprofessional appearance, again, or as I mentioned earlier, if someone like this, dressed completely like this, knocked on your door as a tree care service provider, yeah, I would think to myself, I probably hired the wrong tree care service provider. So I think we get the point in terms of professional behavior. I mean, appearance. So now let's talk about behavior. So in this way, the leader definitely sets the tone. And I think what most customers, clients are going to be looking for is how do the people behave when they're on the property? I think if we think about appearance being a signal or a cue to indicate professionalism, your behavior either confirms or refutes people's initial impressions. So that whole thing about, not judging a book by its cover. However, I think given that fact, we all still look at the cover. And some of us decide to drill in and give the book a chance. However, if we're telling a not so good story, then it's not going to last. So I think in terms of behavior, we need to think about how we as leaders behave, and that influences our crew's professionalism, and it even has implications in our driving habits. And so keeping in mind that our driving habits kind of represent the organization at large. Most of the vehicles have essentially large billboards on the side. And so that's definitely an aspect of image. If it's seen that a company with a huge logo on the side is got a driver that's not driving so respectfully, yeah, someone's going to hear about it and it's going to have an impact. And so we need to be mindful of our behavior in all those aspects. And especially as leaders, we need to be mindful of how we influence our crew. Okay, so as an activity, let's talk about behavior. And so you can see the icon on the bottom there. Utilize the chat feature, and we're going to sort out some of these aspects in terms of whether or not they're actually a do or a don't in terms of professional behavior. So let's utilize the chat feature, get people involved here. All right. Yeah. Okay, first one, yeah, let's not lead in a disrespectful manner towards others. Don't do that. Okay, what about company vehicles? All right, we've got participation going. Yeah, let's try and maintain clean company vehicles. I know it's hard sometimes. We got long days. However, we need to think about what people see when we show up, and seeing a clean vehicle is, yeah, that goes a long way. That's part of the first impression. Maintaining a clean, neat company uniform, that's definitely a do. All right, well, accreditation is important. So I think we all know what that one is. Should we place those logos on the company vehicles? Like I said, we need to be proud of our achievements. Accreditation is a big one. And so we're going to put that in the do side. And lastly, I think we have an open space. We see where it goes. Cursing and smoking on the job site is definitely a don't. All right. So we can move on to quality of work. So that's an important thing. As I mentioned with the story earlier about me getting rid of a service provider, it wasn't about necessarily the appearance. It wasn't necessarily about the fact that they were a well-established company with a service that was seemingly equal in terms of comparison to others. However, my experience was negative given that the quality of work was poor. So we need to think about the customer service aspect of our jobs. I'm seeing in the control panel, I have one question posed in the Q&A. So those of you that are participating, you're thinking about these things, please pose some questions so we can talk about them in the Q&A session, because we're going to get into quite a hefty topic here in terms of tying in the ideas of work quality and creating a culture of professionalism. So with that, quality of work in part is dictated or defined by arboricultural standards. So that includes ANSI standards, best practices, state and local standards. A lot of municipalities have local standards, things that you can do, you can't do, so on and so forth. So we need to be mindful of that when we're considering the idea of quality of work. And so given that there's a lot of variability there, I mean, we know, all of us know ANSI like the back of our hand, I'm sure. And so we can use that as a frame of reference for how we define quality in that broader context. And so I think the most obvious example that is discussed in the crew leader workshop is that a lot of people don't necessarily know quality tree care in terms of what good pruning looks like, but we need to think about what they do notice in terms of the most obvious thing is you could, prune a tree very well and yet not do a good cleanup, and that's what people are going to notice. And so let's think about those things. Think about how quality of work is defined by the customer, and that gives us a good indication of the type of service we need to provide. So yeah, just thinking about what people see when they look at your work, and then what do they remember. And so in this case, I inserted this photograph because I wanted to point out to everybody in terms of what this is. Obviously, it's a tree failure and it fell on somebody's house. And so I think we need to think about when we're delivering quality work, it's not just the arboricultural standards or whether or not we got the tree off the house, those types of things. It's the fact that we've successfully dealt with somebody in a stressful time. So obviously, having a tree fall on your house is not the ideal scenario. You don't want to wake up to this type of image. And certainly, given that, we need to be mindful of what what customers are experiencing as a result of that, and kind of think about it as an aspect of customer service, an aspect of empathy, and all those good interpersonal aspects of the job that we have. And so, yeah, I think it's the idea that as arborists, we certainly work with trees, but this is an aspect of the fact that we work with people in that arena. And so we need to be thinking about that. And we need to think about what type of work product, how do you need to do the work in order to generate repeat business? And it's very simple in my mind. I think this applies not only across the area of delivering a service, but it's also just a good practice in general. And that's be easy to work for, be easy to work with. And then you can start to frame the ideas of what it's like to be a crew leader, as well as what it's like to be dealing with clients. And so I know there's a lot there, a lot of chat stuff. Yeah, so again, remember, pose your questions in Q&A as we're moving along. Yep. All right. So what do I need to generate repeat business? Well, I think it starts with considering the customer's experience. It starts with understanding that as a leader, we set the tone. So with that, there's a lot of aspects to that in terms of culture. Certainly a lot more than we could discuss in a short 1 hour webinar. However, what I'm trying to think of is maybe pointing people in the right direction. I think this is something that I've taken a long time to, I'm fascinated by culture and what drives it, and also how I am placing myself within the culture. I think if we're thinking about culture, it's always defined by people. So it's not only just the people that are in it, it's the people that are observing it. So if we're thinking about that, it's easy to imagine the ways in which the leader sets the tone for that. So there's some working parts there. Let's do the chat, and we can ring in in terms of in what ways does the leader set the tone? So let's see what we got. Yep, culture is always present. Yes, thank you. Positive reinforcement. Yeah, I like that one. Certainly, you can set the tone in a bad way. You can set the tone in a good way. And it has a lot to do with attitude, energy. Wow, we're getting some good stuff here. Communicate what needs to be done, setting examples, setting expectations, leading by example. So that's lots of good stuff there. And so if we're talking about expectations, yeah, we need to prioritize safety, quality work, and accountability, and realizing too that, yeah, we're getting a lot of stuff here on the chat. Good stuff, good participation. I'm going to minimize this for now so I can move on. Yeah, let's understand that the leader sets the tone. And so in that way, they need to think about how they're interacting, how they're managing some of these aspects of culture. And so what types of aspects of culture would we think about managing? I came up with, I like to come up with, you know, if you're thinking about culture, think about 3 things. That's good stuff. It gives us a framework. As far as I know, and I looked it up on Google just this morning. I think, to me, I think it's an original idea. So we're just going to move on. And definitely the idea of expectations, we've already discussed that. Yeah, so expectations and emphasis and experience. So as was mentioned in the chat, people are going to follow the leader's example, and that's called behavior modeling. And so we're going to launch the second poll here in terms of which of the 3 E's is most influential in creating a culture of professionalism. All right, so I'm going to answer, even knowing what I know about the way this was written. And so, yeah, we'll let that marinate. So as we can see, we've got 3 E's: expectations, we've got emphasis, we've got experience. And so there's lots of stuff there. You can answer, I suppose you could answer in the chat, but yeah, let's let the poll, fill out the poll so that we can get a sense of what the group thinks. So I'll just let that one go. I'm just gonna, yeah. So yeah, the leader is definitely setting the tone. And so we want to think about expectations. We already talked about exceeding that. We already talked about what a leader emphasizes, and that's behavior modeling. But I think significantly is experience. So when we think about culture, we're talking about a set of shared values, a set of shared beliefs, if you will. And so in that way, experience is very important in that. So let's just give it away now. And so this was a trick question, everybody. Okay, well, expectations. This was a bit of a trick question. They're all equally important, and they're all influencing one another in a dynamic cycle. So I'll just drill into that. Although expectations are important, we need to consider these other 3 E's, of the 2 E's actually. And so in that way, expectations are driven by what you emphasize. And so as a leader, what people not necessarily, I mean, so there's part of stuff in the sales process that can be considered in setting expectations, but as a leader, you can always manage expectations, not only on the client side, but on the crew side. That has to do with your ability to communicate. And so what people observe in the setting of a work culture is in the absence of information on expectations, they're going to go with what the leader is emphasizing. So as I talked about safety, productivity, and quality, I think that's a good example because when people emphasize one over the other, we run into problems. When they're emphasizing all three in equal measure, then we're probably going to get a good result. So if we're emphasizing safety and quality and productivity, that's basically why we're showing up. And so in that way, as a leader, what we're emphasizing kind of gives us a clue about the expectations. Also, what's emphasized is going to dictate the experience. So as I mentioned, the leader has an opportunity to, through what's emphasized, dictate the experience, whether it's on the crew side, whether it's on the client side, and anything in between. If we're thinking about creating a culture, there is definitely an aspect of experience to defining a culture. And it's basically experiences that are good or bad. And going back to my example of firing a service provider, it wasn't the fact necessarily, it wasn't the image, it wasn't anything like that. It was the fact that my experience was so poor that I just had to get rid of this company and pay to fire them. So that touches on our ability to generate repeat work. And so the customer experience is framed through the leader and what the leader delivers to the client, and also what how the leader is showing that they care about the experience of their crew members, not in terms of like technical experience, but what they're actually experiencing. Although technical experience is very important, it's more what actually happens, what type of environment is being created as a result of the customer experience and the crew. And so lastly, that experience is going to be dictated or influenced by some of the expectations. And as I mentioned, there's some constraints in terms of what the job that was sold, for example. I mean, if you have to prune a tree, you have to prune a tree. That's not necessarily what I'm talking about. I'm talking about how, in what ways can the leader convey expectations in order to make the experience in general more positive for everybody. So in that way, we have a bit of a cycle here. I'm just going to go ahead and check and see if anybody's made some comments on the chat. Yep. There you go. Well, thanks. Experience guides consistent results and performance. Right. So very good. Somebody mentioned engagement. Maybe I could make it 4 E's. I was, yeah, expectations, engagement. I think if we're creating a culture of professionalism, people are going to be naturally engaged to whatever level that they're capable of. And then we could extend that idea as a leader to maybe trying to turn that up a little bit. And then we get back to behavior modeling because, of course, the leader needs to be engaged to promote engagement. So all very good stuff. And so in that way, we are going to move into our question and answer session. So I'm going to open up the Q&A. And all right, so I'm just going to go through. I'm going to answer these live. So like I said, how do I define culture? In terms of culture, I think the textbook definition is shared values and beliefs. And so that's a pretty good way to say it. We don't always see it as played out that in such a clinical manner. And so I think working in occupational safety and being the director of safety, we could also think of it in terms of Yeah, kind of what people do, whether the safety director is there or not. So as the safety director, sometimes I'll show up for a job site visit. People will tell me, oh, you're making me nervous, stuff like that in discussions. And my whole idea with that is culture is defined what people do even when no one else is looking. So in other words, it's what's consistently done, and it's based on expectations, what people think is the right thing to do in the absence of information. And so I think if we look at culture in that way, there's a very textbook way of looking at it, but there's also a very practical way of looking at it, is what do people actually do? What's the gap between what the stated values are and what the actual behavior is? And so I think if we're talking about culture, um, it's what the actual behavior is out on the job site. And so I think, like I indicated previously, the customer can see that. The customer is looking at that, and they're looking for cues that we have a professional culture, that a professional culture exists, and that people are providing a good service at a good value. And so another example that I've used previously in workshops is going to a deli or a coffee shop. You can tell the people that are engaged, and that kind of defines the culture. Someone's friendly and they're talking to you and they're interested in what your experience is. That's completely different than what do you want. And so you might be providing the service at an adequate level. In other words, the customer gets that whatever it is they're after and what they want, and yet their experience was lacking because there was not a connection there. So I think framing that idea with what people experience. Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, we're going back to appearance, high visibility shirts. Yeah, someone's asking if it's better to look dirty or not. Should we be replacing uniforms more often? Yeah, that I can certainly offer my opinion on that. However, that is probably an administrative decision. I pointed that out simply because it says something. And so leaders in companies should be thinking about that, because yes, we want to, I mean, I don't know who has ever watched a tree crew work and not think that they're not working hard. Some people might make it look easy. However, I think everybody that's seen it play out in a live setting knows that it's hard work. So we don't necessarily need to, show it by looking dirty. So I think, as in my opinion, as often as is practical, replace the shirts. And then, if replacing the shirts and there's high vis stuff involved, I mean, I think we could maybe look at other colors. Yeah, I don't know. I think orange might show the dirt a little bit less, but this is all just my opinion. Yeah, okay. So moving on to a couple more. Yes, all right. How do we handle a customer who wants a tree trimmed in the wrong manner, according to or contrary to arboricultural standards? Yeah, I think I'm not sure if this idea is still in the ISA certification or arborist, certified arborist section, but I learned about this a long time ago, and they talked about what's called the appropriate response procedure, in terms of, yes, I mean, I think we would have to answer that question by looking at the local standards, because yeah, we all know that topping is wrong, for example. However, we need to know what's required of that in order to answer that question adequately. So I think that's a personal standpoint in terms of your take on that. I like to follow the standards, and I think a lot of that is at the point of sale with communication with the client to inform them of maybe better ways to handle that. So if we're talking about something like topping, and we could explain all the reasons why topping is not going to achieve the result that they're after. So for example, if they say, oh, we want the tree to be shorter, and so we need to top it because I'm scared about limbs falling down, you could explain to the customer that all the ways that topping will not achieve that result, and the ways in which you can provide what they're after in a arboriculturally sound way. So we can achieve, we can reduce the likelihood of branch failure, for example, through pruning. We don't necessarily need to make the tree smaller to achieve that result. And so I guess in my take on that would be that, this is a lot at the point of sale in terms of communication about what good arboriculture looks like. And then secondly, kind of how we communicate that on the job site with the client. So there's a couple things that I've dealt with in terms of, for example, pruning palms. I'm out here on the West Coast, and people want the palms severely pruned. And I can tell a client that severely pruning is actually going to reinvigorate the tree and make it grow faster. And based on a research standpoint, not only empirical research, but actual research, that it's seen that the heavier we prune palms, the more that they're going to grow. And it's just not good for the structure. So again, it's explaining to people what these concepts are in a way that they can understand, and getting them what they need to achieve the result that they're after. So with that, we've got an anonymous attendee. And yeah, okay, good. I'm glad that this person brought this one up in terms of influencing culture as a non-leader. And I was just looking, doing a little bit of cyber slacking earlier this morning on LinkedIn, and I saw something from Simon Sinek, and he restated something, a belief that I already have, is that you don't need to be, in terms of being a leader, you don't need a title in order to influence people. It's simply showing that you care. It's simply showing an ability to get involved. And so influencing culture as a non-leader, it's in your behavior, it's in your involvement with the process. It's those aspects of appearance, behavior, how you show up, what you do, some of the things that you've done to advance yourself in your career or learn about your craft. It really just depends on what you're trying to influence, what aspect of culture. And so I know from personal experience that you don't need a title to be a leader. And so recently in my organization, we had a grounds person retire, and I had his retirement party. I made it a point to talk about with him the fact that I believe that he was a true leader, despite the fact that he didn't have a leadership title. Because every time I saw him work, he was influencing things on the job site. He was directing things. He was showing people that he cared. And in that way, he was demonstrating leadership behaviors. He was influencing the culture. He was influencing the feeling of what's going on the job in a positive way, with his happiness, with his engagement, with his positivity, in order to influence things, despite the fact that he was a grounds person. And so I think it reminds us of a couple things, specifically that you don't need a title to be a leader, and that being a grounds person and doing it cheerfully is an amazing feat. And so that in and of itself is definitely respectable, because it's drudgery, most of the time. And so keeping it positive and helping things along despite that, I think that's a good way to go. And so anybody can be a leader. We just need to show that we care and that, yeah, we're willing to make a statement on the job site with our work, with our appearance, with our behavior. Okay. All right, so we're talking about even temper. Yes. How can we create an expectation of even temper while on the job? Yeah, this is a good one. Given that I have to deal with a lot of people, a lot of volume, we're a pretty large company. And I think, you know, it's one of those things talked about, it touched on earlier in terms of, you know, we need to learn how to work with people. It's not just tree people dealing with trees. It's the fact that we're doing our tree work and we're also dealing with people. And so I think to answer the question of creating an expectation of even temper while on the job, I think I've drawn the distinction before in terms of like appropriate office behavior, just talking about appropriate behaviors in various contexts as a leader in terms of, okay, we can joke around, we can make jokes, but then once we show up at the job site, it's all professional or something, give people signals. Okay, once I bust out the clipboard, the jokes stop, the nicknames stop, those types of things, and we're in professional mode. So I think it's just thinking about designing that experience that you want and then conveying those expectations. And it may be that you have to discuss these things multiple times in terms of what even temper looks like or what's expected along those lines. And as I said, or as I say from time to time, it's a very difficult job. And so we need to be thinking about ways of not making it even harder with our behavior, with our temper. It can be tough out there. We all make mistakes. However, the more that we clarify our expectations, what we expect to see in terms of behavior, I think the more that we're going to see that. And so I think sometimes it might be an accountability discussion, something like that. And so, yeah, it's part of leadership, and it's part of one of those things that need to occur. And yeah, we've answered that one adequately. All right. Okay. Last question. I think we're getting right in the zone of time. And the last question is a perfect segue. So the second to the last question, we can talk about this for a couple more minutes. So to what degree do we accept a customer's expectations if we feel we have met them already? Talk a lot about this in the crew leader workshop. It's more along the lines of, it's in another topic, but with the crew leader workshop, a lot of these topics overlap, especially when we're having to talk about leadership. Managing expectations, I think to answer the question, accepting customers' expectations, I like to think of the idea of sticking with the facts. So in other words, we could certainly clear up expectations if we referenced the work order. So looking at that, that's what was discussed, and that's something that needs to be managed at the point of sale. So if we have a well-written work order and a customer is requesting more than that beyond the scope, I think you know, there's a couple avenues that you could utilize there in terms of, you know, if it says prune tree, that's a little bit more vague than citing a percentage or citing certain branches, that kind of stuff. I think it really depends on whether or not you're the salesperson or not. And as I mentioned earlier, yeah, people don't always know good arboricultural work, but they know other things and what they're looking at. But if they're trying to add work, um, we can certainly expand the scope. Um, oh, wow, we're getting more questions piling in. Okay, so I better run. Yeah, so that's a complicated question. I think we can rely on the work order if it's well written to refer back to in terms of the facts, the contract that was signed, the scope of work that was discussed, and clear that up. Maybe do a little bit of education about proper pruning. You know, that's a subtle thing. That's an interpersonal skill to have to be able to manage expectations. And we also want to consider that in light of perhaps repeat work, maybe giving a concession, maybe going a little bit further. If you think that it's going to generate more business in the long run, that's a cost benefit analysis that everybody's kind of got to make on their own. Okay, so we're going to get to CEUs, but it's my understanding the code will be given out and it's up to everybody to communicate with ISA in terms of reporting those CEUs. CTSPs, if you are a CTSP, it's done automatically at the point of if you're registered as a CTSP and TCIA knows that you are indeed a CTSP, you'll receive credit. So yeah, and so we're going to give out the code right at the end. And so we're getting towards the end of the session. Okay, what if the customer is highly unprofessional? Yeah, again, very complicated question. I think it's there that we can use our skills in modeling behavior. Yeah, we have to be the better person. Sometimes that's a challenge. However, it can be done. And like I started out the session, sometimes it's not a good fit to work with one another. And so if you fulfilled the contract requirements, okay, well, it's not a good fit. You can just pay me and I'll be on my way. I'll work with somebody else and you can work with whoever you choose to work with. I mean, and anything in between. So, I mean, again, it's more like an aspect of, can you retrieve this situation? Can you retrieve it through communication? Or maybe it's just not a good fit. Okay, last question, and we're getting right down to the wire. Attitudes and behaviors represent the culture of a team and its leader. How does perception affect a professional demeanor? Wow. Yeah, I think that's an aspect of communication for one, but you know, I think with everybody's got different capacities and those types of things. So I think that's not an easy question to answer, given that everybody perceives things slightly different. I think we can assume that everybody wants to do a good job, and that if we clarify what's expected in terms of creating and making that happen, doing a good job, then we can influence professional demeanor. And then there's the modeling. Okay. And lastly, I think I can answer this one very quickly. Number one skill set you look for to promote an employee to crew lead. And most of the time, the climber is not the correct choice. I agree with that. Sometimes we put people that are good technicians in a leadership position without clarifying what they need to do in order to lead. And so in that way, I would combine that answer of having a robust training program and development program combined with somebody that can connect the dots, so to speak. And so I'm going to have to turn this over to Bob. In terms of giving the CEU code, we are out of time. And so I appreciate everybody's participation. I think this workshop went really well in terms of the answers and what we got to learn and discuss here. So I appreciate everybody's attendance. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Bob.
Thank you very much for attending. We do have this crew leader, free webinar crew leader series every Wednesday through May 13th. So the next one coming up is April 29th with Skip Kincaid at 3 to 4 p.m. Skip's going to go over leadership and dealing with crew conflict. And then May 6th, we have Bob Mead going over improving your crew's performance. And on May 13th, we have Chris Rasmussen, going over effective communication with crews and clients. And you can register for next week's session as this link here. But there's also will be a webinar page on the TCIA.org page if you have difficulty finding this link, and this will also be recorded as well and put up on the TCI webinar page. So thank you very much for attending today, and I hope you enjoyed the workshop, and we hope to see you next week.
Thanks, Bob.